Western people are no more rich. Remember the days when Western nations were rolling in cash and bling? When Europeans had most of the world's money and resources tied up in empires? When the American and Australian middle classes shopped till they dropped in post-war suburbia? Or when Nordic countries touted the highest living standards? Pepperidge Farm remembers, and your grandparents definitely remember. But today, the source of economic dynamism has shifted. The West's party of prosperity and dominance has new arrivals. Emerging markets are crashing the exclusive shindig, and a multipolar economic world is taking shape. In a nutshell, Western people are not as rich as they were in the past. But why? In this video, we will quickly dive into how the West lost its economic mojo and why the Western people are not as rich as before. Before we start the chapters of this video, what are your thoughts on the Westerners and their ex-glory days? Let us know with some facts. Chapter 1. The Emergence of the Western Economic Miracle. Over the last 500 years, Western nations have pulled far ahead of the rest of the world economically. The roots of this miracle go back to the 16th century, when European powers realized looting other continents was lucrative. They gobbled up resources and riches from the Americas, Asia, and Africa. By the 1800s, Western nations were ballin' and had made major advances in commerce, finance, and naval. The Industrial Revolution turbocharged Western prosperity. Factory manufacturing, mechanized agriculture, and innovative new business models created massive productivity gains. By the early 20th century, incomes and living standards in the US and Western Europe were many multiples higher than in Africa, Asia, or Latin America. The West had pulled off an economic great escape. Popular culture in the mid-20th century projected images of middle-class America and Europe as suburban utopias with large homes, cars, and material comforts. The American dream usually involved a house with a white picket fence. Madison Avenue advertising portrayed Western goods and brands as aspirational products for all, and even global exports of Hollywood movies and television beamed supposed Western prosperity into other countries. Chapter 2. Before and After. Today, Westerners are no longer significantly richer than people in other parts of the world. This may come as a surprise to some, given the perception that Western countries like the US and Europe are bastions of wealth and affluence. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Westerners are poor, but their lead in terms of income and living standards has shrunk dramatically. When we go back to the 1960s, the peak of Western economic dominance, America accounted for 40% of global GDP according to World Bank data. Yeah, almost half. But now that share has plunged to 25.11% thanks to China and India rapidly expanding their share of the global economic pie at the expense of old Western powers. On the trade front, the share of global exports from major economies like Germany, France, and the UK has almost halved from 25% in 1980 to 13% now, according to WTO data. Their trading dominance has faded as developing countries integrate into global commerce. The story is similar to Australia's middle class, which used to have incomes 80 times greater than India's. Now, that ratio is down to just 22 times. A typical middle-class Indian is no longer as dazzled by the immense financial superiority of Australians. Or let's look at the income gap between everyday folks. In 2000, your average New Yorker was 8 times richer than the average Beijing or Mumbai resident in terms of GDP per person, according to IMF stats. Today, that same New Yorker is only 3 times as well off. While still relatively affluent compared to emerging economies, their lead is not as gigantic and unbridgeable as it once was. So, what happened? Chapter 3. Why Western economic dominance faded. In recent decades, 4 major forces have driven the leveling of global prosperity and the decline of Western economic superiority. Firstly, it's a story of catch-up by the developing world. Emerging economies have grown at a much faster clip, reducing the previously massive prosperity gaps. China's rapid growth since the 1980s is a prime example. After liberalizing its economy, China achieved a GDP growth rate of 10% annually for over 30 years, according to World Bank data. With 4 times the US population, China has transformed into an economic powerhouse. India, too, has accelerated growth since the 1990s, averaging over 6% GDP growth annually, according to IMF statistics, and rapid economic expansion has lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty in both nations. Secondly, technology. The IT revolution provided a template for emerging nations to leapfrog through development stages. As the World Economic Forum notes, digital tools can overcome traditional infrastructure gaps in poorer countries. Smartphone usage is now higher across the developing world thanks to cheap devices and expanding connectivity. Emerging economies are aggressively adopting next-gen technologies from e-commerce to digital finance to farm automation, and this rapid tech absorption boosts productivity and growth. Globalization has also accelerated the diffusion of prosperity. But this globalization left a nasty aftertaste, as manufacturing took a flight to cheaper skies, leaving ghost towns and forgotten dreams in its wake. Offshoring of manufacturing and services jobs from high-cost Western countries to emerging markets like China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, and Vietnam has been sizable. Forrester Research estimates that up to 3.4 million U.S. jobs have been shifted overseas. Developing countries have welcomed these economic opportunities, enabling their citizens' incomes to converge towards Western levels. Finally, contrasting demographics. Aging populations in Europe, North America, and East Asia contribute to slower growth. Meanwhile, African and South Asian nations have a massive demographic dividend on their side, with younger populations entering the workforce. Chapter 4 – Cracks in Western Prosperity as Others Catch Up. While still affluent overall, many Western nations are now struggling with wealth inequality and face economic challenges. Let's begin with the United States, which has more billionaires than any other country. The top 1% of earners take 20% of income, and the bottom 50% of earners take 10% versus just 11% in 1990. In other words, the rich are getting richer, and the poor are getting, well, poorer. Between 10 and 15% for decades, with 37.9 million Americans living in poverty as of 2021. Real median household incomes have gone nowhere, barely rising from $63,000 to $64,000 since 2000 per census data. Years of stagnant wage growth fail to cover rapidly rising costs, and healthcare expenses per person have more than doubled since 1990, surpassing $12,000 annually, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, eroding take-home earnings. Meanwhile, average personal debt now exceeds $92,000 per American household, according to Federal Reserve figures, encompassing credit card balances, student loans, and huge mortgage burdens. Servicing these record debt levels is denting middle-class budgets. On top of it, inflation has hit 40-year highs of 8%, while household savings dwindle from pandemic peaks. Overall, the American dream is increasingly out of reach. Crossing over to the United Kingdom, a similar cost of living crisis plays out. Real incomes dropped over 3% from 2021 to 2022, with inflation in double digits, notes the UK Office of National Statistics. Staples like food, fuel, and housing are becoming painfully unaffordable, so much so that the Food Foundation charity found that over 4 million adults were unable to buy adequate nutrition in 2022. And like in the US, personal debt levels have risen rapidly, with the average UK household owing over £63,000 of personal debt across credit cards, loans, and mortgages per Bank of England, leaving families financially overstretched. Up north in Canada, the picture is muted but still concerning. Wage growth has trailed inflation for most of the past decade, leaving real earnings stagnant, according to Statistics Canada. And the great Canadian dream of home ownership is fading as housing prices gallop ahead, especially in cities like Toronto and Vancouver. Making ends meet is harder, even in this land of plenty. Conclusion: the perceptions of the 20th century that drove terms like First World and Third World are now outdated. The West's economic glory days have passed. Large parts of Asia and the developing world are now on an equal footing with the West, who can no longer depend on wealth and income superiority to exercise influence, and we've entered an era of a truly global middle class. One where your average Westerner is still well off in comparative terms, but no longer towers above the rest in income and living standards like before. Hopefully, Western societies can thrive in this new era, even if they are no longer towering above the rest. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking content.